Consider the Lobster. What's up, everybody, and welcome to episode 14. Today I was planning on doing more of a passive video for me, more of an active video for you, the viewer, because I was reading Consider the Lobster by David Foster Wallace this week, and though I was planning on doing it in a week, it is David Foster Wallace, and I forgot just how detailed he can be. And of course, with all of the footnotes and the endnotes, you kind of have to ping pong back and forth, and just everything is very thick. And so I was really taking my time with a few of these pieces, and on one of the essays, I really stopped and just went, holy shit, as I often do when I'm reading David Foster Wallace. And so for today's video, I wanted to read from one passage in particular on a section that David Foster Wallace is essentially giving a review of an American English usage guide that had just come out at the time. And he goes off on a lot of tangents, but he always likes to explain himself very fully, so each of these tangents end up having these really complex ideas involved. And one of them had to do with the different dialects of English and how those aren't always taught in the English classroom. One of the best metaphors he had for it is one type of student gets beat up in the playground but excels in the classroom, and the other type of student gets beat up in the classroom and excels on the playground. And it's true, there are a lot of kids in school that have a certain way of speaking that makes sense to them. They can communicate with their friends, with their families, but whenever they get into an actual classroom, the standard written English rules really start to get to them. So I'm just going to read this passage really quickly, and I'm going to have some scenery on here so you don't have to just watch me do it the whole time, but at the end of that, I'm going to put forth a couple of my thoughts on it and then really throw the discussion your way, because I think that I'm not necessarily an authority to sit here and preach to anybody, and I really would like to have my perspective broadened one way or another. So if you have any thoughts on this, I would love to hear it, and I will join you down in the comments later. All that being said, let's get started. This passage is found on page 108 of Consider the Lobster and begins shortly after a description of some of the rules of SWE. Just a quick note of clarification, SWE stands for Standard Written English, and any instance of SBE stands for Standard Black English. How much of this stuff do you already know? Standard response equals some variation on, I know from the grades and comments on my papers that the English professors here don't think I'm a good writer. Well, I've got good and bad news. There are some otherwise smart English professors who aren't very aware that there are real dialects of English other than SWE. So when they're marking up your papers, they'll put like incorrect conjugation or comma needed instead of SWE conjugates this verb differently, or SWE calls for a comma here. That's the good news. It's not that you're a bad writer, it's that you haven't learned the special rules of the dialect they want you to write in. Maybe that's not such good news, that they've been grading you down for mistakes in a foreign language you didn't even know was a foreign language, that they won't let you write in SBE. Maybe it seems unfair. If it does, you're probably not going to like this other news. I'm not going to let you write in SBE either. In my class, you have to learn and write in SWE. If you want to study your own primary dialect and its rules and history and how it's different from SWE, fine. There are some great books by scholars of Black English, and I'll help you find some and talk about them with you if you want. But that will be outside of class. In class, in my English class, you will have to master and write in standard written English, which we might just as well call standard white English because it was developed by white people and is used by white people, especially educated, powerful white people. Responses at this point vary too widely to standardize. I'm respecting you enough here to give you what I believe is the straight truth. In this country, SWE is perceived as the dialect of education and intelligence and power and prestige, and anybody of any race, ethnicity, religion, or gender who wants to succeed in American culture has got to be able to use SWE. This is just how it is. You can be glad about it, or sad about it, or deeply pissed off. You can believe it's racist and unfair and decide right here and now to spend every waking minute of your adult life arguing against it, and maybe you should. But I'll tell you something. If you ever want those arguments to get listened to and taken seriously, you're going to have to communicate them in SWE. Because SWE is the dialect our nation uses to talk to itself. African Americans who've become successful and important in U.S. culture know this. That's why King's and X's and Jackson's speeches are in SWE, and why Morrison's and Angelou's and Baldwin's and Weideman's and Gates and West's books are full of totally ass-kicking SWE, and why black judges and politicians and journalists and doctors and teachers communicate professionally in SWE. Some of these people grew up in homes and communities where SWE was the native dialect, and these black people had it much easier in school, but the ones who didn't grow up with SWE realized at some point that they had to learn it and become able to write fluently in it, and so they did. And student's name, you're going to learn to use it too, because I'm going to make you. Just to close off the reading here, it says right after, I should note here that a couple of the students I've said this stuff to were offended, one lodged an official complaint, and that I've had more than one colleague profess to find my spiel racially insensitive. Perhaps you do too. This reviewer's own humble opinion is that some of the cultural and political realities of American life are themselves racially insensitive and elitist and offensive and unfair, and that pussyfooting around these realities with euphemistic doublespeak is not only hypocritical, but toxic to the project of ever really changing them. Now, I've heard various dialects throughout my life, just like most of you presumably have, and it is kind of an interesting idea to pick apart those dialects and realize that, yeah, they are super easy to understand. It's not like it's a complete foreign language, and it's not like it's going to be detrimental to, let's say, 90% of the conversations that people have in their lives. But there are certain times, like the excerpt points out, that you will kind of need to be fluent in standard written English, as unfair as that may seem. One particular instance that was brought to my mind, especially because I've been listening to Serial recently, would be in a court case. If you ever had any certain arguments that were misspoken and were written down and analyzed in standard written English, it could be detrimental to your case and could actually be a negative for you overall. One of the phrases that my girlfriend apparently tells her students when they are getting kind of ornery about learning English is, you have to know the rules before you break them. And this is a point I think David Foster Wallace is trying to get across when he lists out a lot of the great black writers and orators of their time, that they needed to know the rules so that they could break them and create progress. But I don't think some of these English dialects are as detrimental as they used to be. One example I could think of is a book that was brought up during the phone conversation I had with my girlfriend, a book that I had listened to and that she had read, and that is A Brief History of 7 Killings by Marlon James. And there are extended stretches of that novel that are just written in a Jamaican patois. That book went on to win some prestigious awards, including the Man Booker Prize, and was highly regarded by a lot of the English-speaking community. That right there is an example of an English dialect that was used unabashedly and to great success. I really think the tides are changing for English studies, and I'll be really curious to see how English is taught to kids in the future as opposed to how it was taught to me when I was a kid. And that's really about as deep as I'm going to go for this video, because I want to pass it back to you, the viewer, with a few questions. Was David Foster Wallace unfair in his enforcement of the standard written English rules? Did he phrase his argument a little too aggressively? What are your thoughts on the various English dialects and their validity in the English classroom? Do you find yourself fostering a subconscious bias of other dialects? Is there anything I missed? Probably. And are there any other discussions that you would like to have? Leave them all in the comments below and I'll get to them as soon as possible. I'll be back next week with my full review of Consider the Lobster. Until then, I'll be looking forward to hearing from you. Have a great week and I'll see you next time.